Section 5, Scottish Ghost Stories by Elliott O'Donnell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Sallow-Faced Woman of No. FORREST Road, Edinburgh. The public, unfortunately, includes a certain set of people of the middle class, very middlish, who are ever on the lookout for some opportunity, however slight and seemingly remote, of bettering themselves socially, and learning that those in a higher strata of society are interested in the supernatural. They think they might possibly get in touch with them by working up a little local reputation for psychical research. I have often had letters from this type of pusher, letters from genuine believers in the occult I always welcome, stating that they have been greatly interested in my books. Would I be so kind as to grant them a brief interview, or permit them to accompany me to a haunted house, or give them certain information with regard to Lady So-and-so, whom they have long wanted to know? Occasionally, I have been so taken in as to give permission to the writer to call on me, and have always bitterly repented. The wily one, no matter how wily, cannot conceal the cloven hoof for long, and he has either tried to thrust himself into the bosom of my family, or has written to my neighbors declaring himself to be my dearest friend, and when in desperation I have shown him the cold shoulder, he has attacked me virulently in some rag of a local paper, the proprietor, editor, or office boy of which happens to be one of his own clique. I have even known an instance where this type of person has, through trickery, actually gained access to some notoriously haunted house, and from its owners, the family he has long had his eyes on, from a motive anything but psychic, has ferreted out the secret and private history of the haunting. Then, when he has been found out, and forced to see that his friendship is not wanted, he has, in revenge for the slight, unblushingly revealed the facts that were only entrusted to him in the strictest confidence, and through influence with the lower stratum of the press, caused a most glaring and sensational account of the ghost to be published. With such a case in view, I cannot be surprised that possessors of family ghosts and haunted houses should show the greatest reluctance to be approached on the subject, save by those they feel assured will treat it with the utmost delicacy. But I have quoted the above breach of confidence merely to give another reason for my constant use of fictitious names with regard to people and places, and having done so, I hope to some purpose, I will proceed with the following story. Miss Dulcie Vincent, some of whose reminiscences appear in my book of ghostly phenomena last year, is nearly connected with Lady Adela Mencken, who owns a considerable amount of house property, including No. Forest Road in Edinburgh, and whose yacht at Cowes is the envy of all who have cruised in her. 3 years ago, Lady Adela stayed at No. Forest Road. She had heard that the house was haunted, and was anxious to put it to the test. Lady Adela was perfectly open-minded. She had never experienced any occult phenomena herself, but very rationally, she did not consider that her non-acquaintance with the superphysical in any way negated the evidence of those who declare that they have witnessed manifestations. Their statements, she reasoned, were just as worthy of credence as hers. She thus commenced her occupation of the house with a perfectly unbiased mind, resolved to stay there for at least a year, so as to give it a fair trial. The hauntings, she was told, were at their height in the late summer and early autumn. It is, I think, unnecessary to enter into any detailed description of her house. In appearance, it differed very little, if at all, from those adjoining it. In construction, it was, if anything, a trifle larger. The basement, which included the usual kitchen, offices, and cellars, was very dark, and the atmosphere after sunset on Fridays, only on Fridays, was tainted with the smell of damp earth, shockingly damp earth, and of a sweet and nauseating something that greatly puzzled Lady Adela. All the rooms in the house were of fair dimensions and cheerful, except on this particular evening of the week. A distinct gloom settled on them then, and the strangest of shadows were seen playing about the passages and on the landings. It may be fancy, Lady Adela said to herself, merely fancy, and, after all, if I encounter nothing worse than a weekly menu of aromatic smells and easily digested shadows, I shall not suffer any harm. But it was early summer then. The psychic season had yet to come. As the weeks went by, the shadows and the smell grew more and more pronounced, and by the arrival of August it had become so emphatic that Lady Adela could not help thinking they were both hostile and aggressive. About 8 o'clock on the evening of the second Friday in the month, Lady Adela was purposely alone in the basement of the house. The servants especially irritated her, like the majority of present-day domestics, products of the county council schools. They were so intensely supercilious and silly, and Lady Adela felt that their presence in the house minimized her chances of seeing a ghost. No apparition with the smallest amount of self-respect would risk coming in contact with such inane creatures, so she sent them all out for a motor drive, and for once rejoiced in the house to herself. A curious proceeding for a lady, true, but then Lady Adela was a lady, and being a lady, was not afraid of being thought anything else, and so acted just as unconventionally as she chose. But stay a moment. She was not alone in the house, for she had 3 of her dogs with her, 3 beautiful boarhounds, trophies from her last trip to the Baltic. With such colossal and perfectly trained companions, Lady Adela felt absolutely safe and ready, as she acknowledged afterwards, to face a whole army of spooks. She did not even shiver when the front door of the basement closed, and she heard the sonorous burring of the motor, drowning the giddy voices of the servants, grow fainter and fainter until it finally ceased altogether. When the last echoes of the vehicle died away in the distance, Lady Adela made a tour of the premises. The housekeeper's room pleased her immensely. At least she persuaded herself it did. "Why, it is quite as nice as any of the rooms upstairs," she said aloud, as she stood with her face to the failing sunbeams and rested her strong white hand on the edge of the table. "Quite as nice. Carl and Max, come here." But the boarhounds for once in their lives did not obey her with a good grace. There was something in the room they did not like, and they showed how strong was their resentment by slinking unwillingly through the doorway. "I wonder why that is," Lady Adela mused. "I have never known them do that before." Then her eyes wandered around the walls, and struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the room, which had suddenly grown dark. She tried to assure herself that this was but the natural effect of the departing daylight, and that, had she watched in other houses at this particular time, she would have noticed the same thing. To show how little she minded the gloom, she went up to the darkest corner and prodded the walls with her riding whip. She laughed. There was nothing there, nothing whatsoever to be afraid of, only shadows. With a careless shrug of her shoulders, she strutted into the passage, and whistling to Carl and Max, who, contrary to their custom, would not keep to heel, made another inspection of the kitchens. At the top of the cellar steps she halted. The darkness had now set in everywhere, and she argued that it would be foolish to venture into such dungeon-like places without a light. She soon found one, and, armed with candles and matches, began her descent. There were several cellars, and they presented such a dismal, dark appearance that she instinctively drew her skirts tightly around her and exchanged the slender riding whip for a poker. She whistled again to her dogs. They did not answer, so she called them both by name angrily, but for some reason, some quite unaccountable reason, she told herself, they would not come. She ransacked her mind to recall some popular operatic air, and although she knew scores, she could not remember one. Indeed, the only air that filtered back to her was one she detested, a vaudeville tune she had heard 3 nights in succession when she was staying with a student friend in the Latin Quarter in Paris. She hummed it loudly, however, and holding the lighted candle high above her head, walked down the steps. At the bottom she stood still and listened. From high above her came the noises which sounded like the rumbling of distant thunder, but which, on analysis, proved to be the rattling of window frames. Reassured that she had no cause for alarm, Lady Adela advanced. Something black scudded across the red-tiled floor, and she made a dash at it with her poker. The concussion woke countless echoes in the cellars, and called into existence legions of other black things that darted hither and thither in all directions. She burst out laughing. They were only beetles. Facing her, she now perceived an inner cellar, which was far gloomier than the one in which she stood. The ceiling was very low, and appeared to be crushed down beneath the burden of a stupendous weight, and as she advanced beneath it she half expected that it would cave in and bury her. A few feet from the center of the cellar she stopped, and bending down, examined the floor carefully. The tiles were unmistakably newer here than elsewhere, and presented the appearance of having been put in at no very distant date. The dampness of the atmosphere was intense, a fact which struck Lady Adela as somewhat odd, since the floor and walls looked singularly dry. To find out if this were the case, she ran her fingers over the walls, and on removing them, found they showed no signs of moisture. Then she rapped the floor and walls, and could discover no indications of hollowness. She sniffed the air, and a great wave of something sweet and sickly half choked her. She drew out her handkerchief and beat the air vigorously with it, but the smell remained, and she could not in any way account for it. She turned to leave the cellar, and the flame of her candle burned blue. Then, for the first time that evening, almost, indeed for the first time in her life, she felt afraid. So afraid that she made no attempt to diagnose her fear. She understood the dogs' feelings now, and caught herself wondering how much they knew. She whistled to them again, Not because she thought they would respond, she knew only too well they would not, but because she wanted company, and even the company of her own voice. And she had some faint hope, too, that whatever might be with her in the cellar would not readily disclose itself if she made a noise. The one cellar was past, and she was nearly across the floor of the other when she heard a crash. The candle dropped from her hand, and all the blood in her body rushed to her heart. She could never have imagined it was so terrible to be frightened. She tried to pull herself together and be calm, but she was no longer mistress of her limbs. Her knees knocked together and her hands shook. It was only the dogs, she feebly told herself. I will call them. But when she opened her mouth, she found her throat was paralyzed. Not a syllable would come. She knew, too, that she had lied, and that the hounds could not have been responsible for the noise. It was like nothing she had ever heard, nothing she could imagine, and although she struggled hard against the idea, she could not help associating the sound with the cause of the candle burning blue and the sweet, sickly smell. Incapable of moving a step, she was forced to listen in breathless expectancy for a reoccurrence of the crash. Her thoughts became ghastly. The inky sea of darkness that hemmed her in on every side suggested every sort of ghoulish possibility, and with each pulsation of her overstrained heart, her flesh crawled. Another sound, this time not a crash, nothing half so loud or definite, drew her eyes in the direction of the steps. An object was now standing at the top of them, something lurid, like the faint phosphorescent glow of decay, emanated from all over it. But what it was she could not for the life of her tell.